Hi, good morning. This is the first of two videos that Faye and I have put together that are really very clear about the peak principles. What are our guiding principles? What's our North Star for the work that we do to help parents recover from the trauma of parental estrangement? Thanks for being here today. So today, Faye and I have gotten together so that we can discuss the peak principles, which is something that we have never really put on the YouTube channel or on the website. So we'll share today with you the 14 principles, and you'll be able to link in the description below to the principles on the website. And that way you can get a copy of them for yourself if you'd like to use that. So let me start by just asking you, Faye, to explain why these principles might be important to somebody who's considering using peak in their recovery process.
Sure. Well, yeah, thanks, Kelly. I think one of the things that we observe as we were working with estranged parents in peak groups is they often will express that this is the first time they've really felt understood. And as estranged parents, we've been often looking a long time to find a place where we feel understood. So why do they feel understood? Well, a big part of that is these principles that we're talking about really are the foundation of everything that we do. And they really create a kind of environment where people have a shared understanding of what we're about and where people can feel understood. And it's also about how do we move forward in a recovery process? What principles are going to help us? And in that sense, it's a little bit like the 12 steps of AA. I mean, we're not a 12-step group, but we similarly have principles that are a part of that recovery process. And so not only does it help people feel understood, that by kind of attending to these principles, they get better. And that's what we're really about, is people getting better, people recovering and getting their life back again.
Yeah, that's true. I've heard that over and over in our groups about how people finally feel like somebody sees just what they're going through and what they're struggling with. And I think that is a comfort for people. They become more comfortable and they can understand the process and relax into the process and say, this is the way to go. And they've really sort of, as I've observed for us, developed over time as we've recognized what is helping people recover best. So I think the first one on our list is really important. It's peak seeks to be evidence-based. And so when I see that as a researcher, it just warms my heart because I can speak with authority if I have evidence to support that has been researched properly and peer reviewed. And really speaks to your first book, soon to be updated, when you are sharing from your own experience. There's the first part of evidence-based, and it resonates. Do you want to talk a little bit about that sharing in that book and the how evidence-based came to be important to you?
Well, evidence-based is important to me because it goes back a long time to when I was a kid building model rockets and trying to get equations on how high they would go. So, and then of course my undergraduate in engineering physics and work in research. So evidence has always been important to me. Became increasingly important, I think, as we're dealing with these really challenging personal issues and you're trying to understand it. And without some sense of the bigger picture and what other people are going through and some kind of reliable indication, you really feel lost in at the whims of this idea or that idea or this person's opinion. Evidence always gives me a sense of grounding in terms of what's real, what's reality. And so I, I really appreciate the experience that a variety of estranged parents have shared with us, with you, with me, and others. That becomes a part of the data, but it really needs to be understood in the context of some of the greater research that's been done, so that we don't, chase down one direction or another just based upon my personal story. I think one of the things, Keli, that and I know you as a researcher will appreciate this, and as a therapist, you always want to be aware of what you're projecting, right, on other people. This may be my experience. I think about that all the time. Everything I write, everyone I talk to, I ask the question, Faye, is this just your experience, or is this something that's broader that we all kind of share? And research helps kind of broaden that confidence that we're dealing with something that's not just me. It's about more than me. It's about all of us.
And I think that's important for our people who are estranged and looking for help, because there's so much that's written and videoed out there, blogged out there, podcasted out there, that does come from one person's perspective. And it can be very hurtful and painful. So the evidence-based, where it's a little bit more fact-based and it's not coming from a place of personal pain, is important. The second principle that we recognize that works for our groups is really on us. It's how peak is going to help people. And so I know you and I have a story a little bit about the use of compassion and candor. And so for the second principle, it's stated that peak helps estranged parents understand the reality of parental estrangement through processes that balance compassion and candor. Do you want to speak a little bit about like why that came up for you when we were first talking, and I was mentioning the reconciliation rates? And so if you speak a little bit about that part of it and the importance that holds for you.
Yeah. I do think it's really important for parents to engage in their recovery process. Well, what can keep that from happening? Well, one thing that can keep it from happening is if they have a hope or something for reconciliation to happen in a way that's really unlikely. And so they keep delaying kind of their own recovery, their own healing, their own rebuilding of their lives in hopes of something that the research shows is not likely to happen, at least not happen in the short term, and with significant and the need for preparation and healing on their part. So as I look at have looked at what's out there again in terms of the internet articles, that kind of thing, I've just been very concerned that we're putting parents in a situation where they don't understand kind of what they're dealing with, and because of that, they don't have adequate encouragement to move in the direction of taking care of themselves, recovering from this trauma, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later, because folks aren't being honest with them. But we want to be honest with them in a way that is caring for them. This is very difficult. They're already traumatized. And so when we talk about being candid with them, we want to do it in a way that is compassionate, allows people to kind of live into that at their own pace, because we all have this thing called denial, right?
Yeah.
But denial serves a purpose, as you know, Kelly. It kind of paces our acceptance of reality uh, at a rate in which we can and are prepared to deal with that. So we want to help people kind of come to understand what they're dealing with in a way that's honest, that's candid, but we want to do it compassionately in a way that they're ready to receive it in a way that will be helpful to them.
Yeah. And I from my perspective as a therapist, I think it's ethical. I think it's important in our ethics to be able to let people understand probability and what the work is to make it more possible, and not to mislead them by um, hiding anything from them.
Absolutely. And I think in other fields, um, when you look at what we think is the recovery rate, reconciliation rate, I mean, it's as low as the worst forms of cancer. And we would expect, ethically, the American Medical Association requires physicians to really disclose to patients when they're dealing with something that serious.
Yeah.
Requires them to ethically disclose that. And part of that is just so how do they focus their energies on things that make good use of their time, of their life. And that's essentially what we're saying. We want you to be able to focus your energy on things that will make for your healing, your life, a sense of purpose. It's not there to hurt you, it's there to help you focus.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, almost like a motivation to say I really do need to engage in recovery, because
Yeah,
if reconciliation is going to happen, I need to be better myself. And you and I think, have both discovered that engaging in the recovery process really does prepare someone for the reconciliation process in a way that nobody else can do. So, and with that said, that's our next principle, is that we adopt in Peak, we adopt a no fault perspective. And I'm gonna ask you to say a little bit about that, but then I want to share a little bit about Bowen and why that's so important to the work we do, the Bowen family systems theory.
yeah, that's one of my favorite principles. I just think it's extremely important. And of course, um, folks have probably heard me use the analogy of, when someone's in a car accident and they're wheeled into an emergency department, the staff don't stand back and say, before we treat you, we need to know whose fault this was. People are suffering on both sides of this issue. The adult children are suffering, the parents are suffering, and it really doesn't advance the process of healing to spend your energy trying to establish blame. Recovery, healing, really requires turning attention to the wounds that we are dealing with, and taking responsibility for those, and getting kind of sidetracked and blaming one or the other, um, just spends an energy in directions other than in the healing process. So, and of course, coming from my particular faith tradition, where grace is a really important part of my faith, I think both giving and receiving grace, acknowledging that we're all flawed, is just a central part of being a human being and living in community with one another.
Mm. And from the theoretical perspective, where we talk about the no fault perspective, it everybody is in this together. It's a dynamic. It's not a unilateral experience. It's like touching a mobile. You can't touch one part of the mobile without affecting the whole mobile. And so,
And that's where I get, I'm sorry, go ahead, Kelly. Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that that's why I so much endorse the Bowen family systems theory as a way of dealing with this. It's the only theory that talks about cutoff. They call estrangement cutoff. It's the only theory that I know of that really addresses it directly. So therapists who are trained in that are really well prepared to deal with this. And what you were going to say something else.
Well, and that's, I think, one of the slippery slopes on the internet is, different groups can, and I understand this, but they can get focused on, parents can get focused on the adult children and their hurt and their pain and their anger and what they've done to them, and vice versa. And I think that's part of what makes Peak, this principle, really important to Peak, is that we're not about that. We're not about just being a group of angry parents
Yeah.
blaming our kids. We're about that. It doesn't matter. We all need to heal.
Yes. And all need to and all deserve to recover, as you've so eloquently said before. And that leads again right to the very next one, that we assert, Pete asserts that parental estrangement results in parental trauma, which may be real news to people, and it may be really resonating with other people who have experienced the outcomes from
Yes.
estrangement. Do you want to say a little bit about that? Because your experience is what informed and sort of triggered that thinking for you.
Yeah, and when I first wrote the book, Kelly, and I um, started thinking about this and wrote about it as trauma, I was a little nervous because I don't want to exaggerate and I don't want to overstate, what it is we're dealing with. But now, after literally hundreds of conversations, communications, correspondence, whatever, with estranged parents, I'm just convinced that we're dealing with trauma. We're dealing with similar symptoms that somebody coming back from a combat zone would experience, and those trauma symptoms, and you're in a far better position to talk about them, clinically than I am. But we just see the effect on the thought patterns of people, and the preoccupation that they have in their thought processes with what's happening to them, and it takes up so much mental space. And there's all the emotional reactions, and in terms of anxiety and guilt and depression. It affects other relationships in similar ways that we see other trauma affecting relationships. It affects people physically. And I think this has been the biggest kind of insight to me, is trauma is stored in the body, as somebody has written. And so many of the parents that we're talking to are having, the GI disturbances. They're having arrhythmias that are now developing or aggravated, or other heart issues. They're having inflammation issues. They're breaking out on their bodies. They're having headaches. I mean, there are so many physical symptoms to this as well. So yeah, I'm convinced we're dealing with trauma, and we've given it a name. We call it parental trauma. If you internet that, if you Google that on the internet, you're not going to find it referring to estranged parents. You're going to find it referring to what happens to young children, when their parents are traumatized.
Yes, yes.
That's what all the hits are. But I think we're dealing with parental trauma. We're dealing with something very significant that's happening to parents that affects all these dimensions of their lives.
that really hits on our fifth point as well, that it impedes the sound decision making and constructive behaviors, engaging in peak recovery even. Trauma will affect all of that. And, when we think about trauma, one of the things that I've had parents do is to just draw a timeline that shows me anything chronic they've had, like if they're diabetic, if they have lupus, anything of that sort of chronic Lyme disease, and to just show me on the timeline sort of where that showed up in their life. And then I ask about flare-ups. When did your, sugar end up going kind of crazy on you? When did your lupus flare up? What did that look like? When did your brain fog return from the chronic Lyme disease? And when they start to show those flare-ups, and then the last thing I'll say to them is, show me on this timeline where you feel like your estrangement began. And they're always amazed to see how these flare-ups almost inevitably come after that, and they come in groups. So it is your body is certainly reacting like it's a trauma, and your emotions do as well. So we covered 4 and 5 in that one. It's not just a trauma, but we also believe that it's impeding their decision making.
And it's the other thing Kelly is doing is having behavioral consequences. So we have people who have outbursts, and I hear people saying they've done things, they've thrown things, and it's like, I've never done that before in my life.
Mm-hmm.
There are behavioral consequences, or they're trying to cope with the pain by maybe they're drinking more.
That's true.
Than they were before. They're using other substances, or they're eating more, eating less. I mean, there are behavioral consequences as well. So these are very significant impacts upon a parent's life.
Another term I've heard as we're talking about this, Faye, from a number of parents, both in my office as well as in our groups, is there are times when they feel like they're unraveling. And I think that that's the best way that they can describe. They're not throwing things, and they're not having outbursts at others, but they can't think. They're breathing shallow. They feel paralyzed. They catch themselves staring at the television and recognize that it's been 2 hours and they're just coming apart. So the behavioral piece is pretty evident for people, and that's sort of there. It's almost impossible in trauma to not have a behavioral consequence, and then of course it's affecting other people around you too. So so while we're looking at this, the 6th peak principle focuses on recovery as primary, and that might be surprising to people. And I think I can say a little bit about that because of the reconciliation rate we know is low. And like we mentioned earlier, that it doesn't feel ethical to promote reconciliation as an outcome, or the only outcome, or the first outcome. Do you want to say anything about that? Being our primary focus is recovery more than reconciliation?
So one of the things that I think is clear, and I've seen some research on this, is that when people are dealing with trauma, they're just not at their best. And they may not be making great decisions. In some cases, they may not be making decisions at all because they're just frozen by the trauma. The process of reconciliation is extremely complex, and there are so many things, so many issues that are a part of that need to be managed. And so when we ask a person dealing with parental trauma to engage in a process of reconciliation, this is kind of what concerns me sometimes about some of the articles that I see, a lot of which I agree with, but when they talk about, like, these are the steps, to reconciliation, you're talking about a very complex process. in most cases. And so you have a traumatized parent who's having trouble thinking, who's having all these emotional reactions, who's having, behavioral issues. And you're asking them to do something extremely complex. And I say it's a little bit like asking a person who's just been involved in a head-on collision to play chess with someone who doesn't want to play, to win at chess and a game that no one wants to play. And so what we're basically saying is that in order to engage in that process at whatever point, they're usually not in control of it. The adult child has made that decision. But at whatever point that opportunity opens up, people are going to be best prepared for that. And I know, Kelly, you can speak to this. Best prepared for that through a recovery process that's dealt with this trauma and with a number of other things. They'll be really ready to do that work, and it is work. And so, yeah, we are focused on that recovery process, as we think that really is one, essential if they're going to have a successful reconciliation down the road at whatever point that might occur. But it's just essential to their well-being. The world needs them to be good, to be well, to be healthy, to be strong, and I want that for them too.
Yeah, and I guess the best way that I address it continually, I'm like a broken record, is that reconciliation rates are low enough, but if you are not engaging in recovery, you are not increasing your chances for a successful, sustainable reconciliation. And I think that that's probably the piece that seems so important to me, is that it will help if you're given the opportunity by your child to engage in reconciliation. At least one of you will be better prepared to do that.
Yes.
Yeah.
What we see when people aren't prepared to do that, Kelly, I think, is they just, at the thought of seeing their adult child, they just fall apart. I've seen that happen repeatedly. It's like, oh, my child is going to be at a wedding I'm going to be at, or at a funeral, or I'm going to have to deal with this kind of situation and with them, and they just fall apart. I mean, they just don't have the capacity to enter into that process, and that's not judgment of them at all. It's just a reflection of what they've experienced and their need for healing.
Mm. Okay, so the next peak principle is one that we have collectively noted, and I think at this point we have had hundreds of people involved in some sort of emailing back and forth with you and I, or involved in groups and group development. And that, what we've noticed is that the prognosis for recovery in and of itself is, from the trauma of parental estrangement, is good. And I would say that that is a fair statement to make. The prognosis for recovery from parental trauma is good if you are involved in peak. What have you, in all of your experience, we may have different observations on this, but in your experience with groups, what are you thinking that you are seeing in folks that seems to be the most relief for them and provide the most encouragement for them when they're engaging with us or in groups?
Mm. Well, I think the first thing is just knowing, I mean, first, I know it seems very simple, but it's so profound that they're not alone, because it feels very isolating. And so when they discover that they're not alone and there are flesh and blood people that are, in this group with them, who are sharing similar experiences, there's just a huge relief just from that. I'd say that's number one. I'd say the second thing is being able to acknowledge their experiences and part of what we do, as you know, Kelly, is at near the beginning of every meeting, we read the common experiences, where there's a list that we read through, and like this is what it's like. This is what it feels like to be an estranged parent. And what I've observed often at in the first meeting or two, when people read that, they choke up. Um, uh, they say, "I don't know if I can get through this," because for the first time, their experience is being validated. It's like I'm not crazy, and I'm not some strange human being. This is happening, and 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 I can say it, and I can feel that it's understood. So I think those two things, knowing that they're not alone, but also being able to talk honestly and in a way they just haven't been able to previously. It's just extremely powerful.
I would agree with those. And I think the thing I would add that I either have gotten back in emails or even in the group um, feedback when we ask for their feedback is that there's no sense of judgment. They just don't feel like anybody is judging them as good parents or bad parents or worthy or unworthy. And that I think is a part that I have seen that really helps with the recovery from the trauma.
Absolutely. And I mean, because often they're feeling judged everywhere. I mean, there's, of course, the feeling judged by their children that have cut them off. Um, Often there are other family members or even friends that look at them and it's like, you must have done something. This must be your fault. Um, as somebody who's involved in the Christian church, it's not addressed there, um, and there's the judgment that people levy against themselves. Maybe that's
Yes.
times in because who envisions this? No one envisions this. No parent, when their child was born or when they brought that child home, an adopted child. No one envisions this. Nobody wants this as an outcome. No. Um, and so everyone's kind of doing their best they can, and they feel like they've totally failed. And so, yeah, I totally agree with you. I think people encounter this space of grace, if you will, where they're not judged, and that's transformative.
It is. So we've covered the first 7 out of 14 principles, and I think this might be a good place for a break for making sure that our video is not too awfully long for people. So we'll take a break here and let people have the opportunity to pick up in the next video.